Far across the Pacific, almost 7 miles from the United States, are the Philippines, a group of 7,091 islands which make up the new independent Philippine Republic. Of all the countries invaded by the Axis powers in World War II, few were more complete. As peace came to their ruined cities and farms, the Filipinos, with the independence the U.S. had promised them only a year away, found they had little left with which to begin life as a nation. The 43 different racial groups, with no common culture or tradition, the Philippines became a Spanish possession following their discovery by Magellan in 1521. Entirely dominated by their Spanish rulers, the Filipino people in 3 centuries made little economic or political progress. After Admiral George Dewey's victory at Manila Bay in 1898, Spain was forced to cede the Philippines to the United States. Implacably opposed to American occupation of the Philippines was General Emilio Aguinaldo, who for 2 years up to 1901 was the leader of revolt against U.S. government in the islands, and who never became reconciled to the presence of American troops. But as the benevolence of U.S. rule won recognition, and American ideas of democracy were introduced into the Philippines, an orderly and peaceful campaign for self-government began. Staunchest champion of the Philippine independence movement for over a quarter of a century was the late Manuel Luis Quezon, who by 1934 had secured from the U.S. a Commonwealth status for the Philippines and the promise of complete freedom by 1946. For his services in the struggle for independence, grateful Filipinos in 1935 elected Manuel Quezon as first president of their new Commonwealth. By the time President Quezon assumed office, the Philippines, under U.S. rule, had achieved a degree of progress and prosperity unmatched among any of the dependent peoples of the Far East. But this prosperity was not widely distributed, and the living standard of the masses of Filipinos was high only in comparison with the rest of the Orient. Mainstay of Philippine economy was agriculture, with rice as the one big food crop. The island's farms were largely held by big landowners, for whom millions of poorly paid Filipinos worked in lifelong peonage. Few of these were able to acquire land of their own, though 3/4 of the island's arable soil lay idle. Of the few exportable crops on which Philippine prosperity depended, most important was cane sugar, of which the Philippines produced over 1 million tons a year, exporting almost 2/3 of it to the United States. Another major source of income in the islands was the growing of abaca and its processing into Manila hemp. A strong fiber found only in the Philippines, hemp is converted into a rope of outstanding quality in demand throughout the world. Included among the island's great mineral resources of still undetermined extent are immense deposits of chromite, which were found less than 20 years ago, and huge veins of gold discovered on the island of Luzon. Among the richest in the world, these mines are capable of producing as much as 1 million fine ounces of gold each year. But all these industries brought benefits chiefly to a few shrewd investors who formed a small ownership class. Between this group and the great masses of Philippine people, there existed almost no middle class. In pre-war times, foreigners controlled many of the biggest Philippine industries. and the economy of the islands, based almost entirely upon trade with the U.S., depended chiefly upon tariff concessions which gave Philippine products a favored position in American markets. During the 4 decades of American rule, more money was spent on public health and education than on any other function of government. An almost universal illiteracy was greatly reduced through the establishment in every village and town of at least one primary school, with much of the teaching modeled after U.S. methods of progressive education. To send a son or a daughter to the University of the Philippines, Filipinos were willing to make tremendous sacrifices, for the ambition of most families was to have at least one girl or boy graduate into some respected business or profession. Until Philippine independence would finally take effect, defense of the islands rested upon the U.S. fleet units based at Cavite in Manila Bay and upon the U.S. Air Forces assembled and maintained in the Philippines. But Filipinos knew that from the day their freedom became an accomplished fact, the responsibility for national defense might well be theirs. General Douglas MacArthur, who with Major Dwight Eisenhower as his assistant commanded American forces in the Philippines, was the man President Quezon chose to head the new Philippine military establishment. MacArthur set out on a program by which he hoped, within 10 years, to have a trained army of 300,000, capable of holding off any threatened invasion. But before MacArthur's military program was half completed, war struck the Philippines. Within 5 months, Japan overwhelmed the few thousand ill-equipped American and Filipino troops defending the islands. And in place of the Americans, who had governed with justice and who promised freedom, came the Japanese, who governed by the sword and offered nothing but slavery. Of all the dependent peoples of Asia, the common people of the Philippines alone united to resist the conqueror. All over the islands, behind Japanese lines, guerrilla armies sprang up. Filipinos of many races, religions, and dialects forgot their differences. With whatever weapons were at hand, plus what could be smuggled in, the Filipino guerrillas fought the Japanese for 3 hard years. Many American Army officers who had avoided capture were among their leaders. To these, the Filipino guerrillas funneled military information which proved invaluable to U.S. operations in the Pacific. With the triumphant return of MacArthur, backed by powerful armies and an immense supply organization, the U.S. put to full use the fighting effectiveness of the island's guerrillas. Outfitted with American weapons and equipment, they joined forces with MacArthur's men in the final hard-fought campaign to wipe out the Japanese. Within 9 months of the first landing on Leyte, U.S. forces had virtually completed the liberation of the island. Everywhere the Americans were greeted as saviors by a grateful people. To the Filipinos, this was the vindication of their faith in the United States and in their hero, General Douglas MacArthur. After 3 long years of slavery, the Philippine people could once again live in freedom. And to their American allies, beside whom they had fought so valiantly, they looked hopefully for aid in peace as they had in war. As they faced the gigantic task of rehabilitation, the Filipinos had ample need of the stoicism and courage they had shown under occupation. With supplies drastically depleted, food allowances had to be restricted to the barest minimum. and the hunt for enough nourishment to keep alive became an endless preoccupation of city dwellers. To start the monumental task of reconstruction, as well as to create employment, the Philippine government set out, with the help of the U.S. Army, to enroll available workers in a temporary labor pool. Thousands of men signed up for an intensive course of training in American Army engineering methods and were employed all over the islands, clearing the debris of war to make way for the establishments of peace. In Manila Harbor, laborious salvage operations were begun to recover for the Philippine government $8.5 million worth of coins, all the silver in the island's pre-war treasury, which had been dumped into the bay early in the war to prevent its falling into Japanese hands. For months, Army and Navy divers worked in 20 fathoms of water to reclaim the treasure, which had lain there since before the fall of Corregidor. First step in reorganizing the financial life of the islands was to restore banking facilities and make possible the ordinary business transactions of peacetime. For until Philippine commerce and industry could be reestablished, there would be no adequate source of tax revenues with which to finance rehabilitation. The need for money and construction materials was immediate and urgent, and for these, there was only one place to turn: the United States. Recognizing this fact, the U.S. sent to Manila a mission headed by Senator Millard E. Tydings to determine the extent of the assistance the Philippines would need. On the recommendation of the Tydings report, the U.S. in 1946 granted President Sergio Osmeño's government over $500 million for reconstruction, plus special tariff and trade privileges to last for 28 years. Though the path ahead is still a thorny one, the people of the Philippines have at least gained from the war a new regard for democracy and are today politically alive and active. Proud of the part they played in liberation, newly conscious of their collective power, the ordinary people of the islands are demanding a bigger stake in the future of the country for which they fought. Voting for a president to lead their infant republic through its first 4 critical years of independence, the Philippine people chose Manuel Acuña Rojas, long the leader of the Insular Senate. A skilled and experienced politician, Manuel Rojas is an able economist as well. With freedom at last, and with the sorely needed financial and economic assistance of the U.S. already theirs, the 18 million citizens of the Philippines are today setting out on the high road of independence. Aware as never before of their national identity, they are determined to make for themselves a respected place in the family of free and independent nations.